not look well.
Go ahead, Tricia.
Okay. So, hi, Michelle. I'm Tricia. It's nice to
Hi.
meet you face on the screen.
Face to face, yes.
Thank you for being here. Michelle's coming to us in person at St. George Episcopal Church. And she's from Houston and she has a history of adult education. And so we're happy to have her with us. She is an active lay chaplain and a member of the Benedictine Oblates. So if you want to unmute your speaker, Michelle, and begin whenever you are ready.
You're fine. Go ahead.
I'm good.
Okay.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me to be your guest speaker today. It's an honor and a privilege to be here with you. My connection to International Community of Hope has been a life-altering experience in many ways. And it's just an additional component of my spiritual journey. I'll just take a couple of seconds to let you know how I became a Benedictine Oblate. And it was through a happy accident. A very close friend of mine is a retired Lutheran minister, and she had had an accident. She broke her ankle, and she lives in Katy, and I live close to downtown Houston. So sadly, we don't get to see each other all that frequently. And I asked her if there was what I could do for her. And she said, I really want to go to church, because she had recently retired and she felt uncomfortable being a parishioner at the church that she was the minister for, and her husband was on the vestry. So she had explored and found this little church. And so I drove out, picked her up, took her to church. And before the service began, Lene Schatz, who you probably know, is very active in the International Community of Hope, and she does community engagement at Kinsman Lutheran Church in Northwest Houston, which is where I got my training as a lay chaplain. And she was there presenting a certificate of completion of the pastoral care program to one of the members of the congregation. And she mentioned Benedictine spirituality. So during the hospitality section, after the service, I went up to her and I said, tell me about this program. I'm a Benedictine Oblate. And she said, oh, then you must know Brother Michael and Father Peter, who are establishing a Benedictine monastery in Beaumont. I said, no, you mean I have Benedictine monks who are my neighbors? I've been driving to Arkansas, going to Arkansas for over 20 years. Anyway, she told me about this program, the International Community of Hope and the Pastoral Care Program, and that you can become a lay chaplain. And the whole thing is grounded in Benedictine spirituality. And I thought, I can do this, because I became a Benedictine Oblate when I found out that the rule of Benedict starts with the word listen, and the Benedictines are committed to hospitality. For over 15 years, the Benedictines have been known for the hostels and the hotels that they founded and supported. I mean, St. Benedict started in a cave, but they progressed very fashionably into opening their doors, because it comes from scripture that you treat every person, including the stranger, as if that person is Jesus Christ. And I thought, I can do this. I'm a language educator and I'm an Italian. So listening and hospitality, how bad can that be? And so in 2010, I became invested by the abbot of Subiaco Monastery, which is in Northwest Arkansas. And in 2018, I became a lay chaplain through the International Community of Hope. And it's just been an extraordinary journey. And my current ministry as a lay chaplain is to the Catholic Newman Center at the University of Houston. And the group of students I work with are young people who are exploring Catholicism for their faith journey. And as a cradle Catholic, it's been a great experience for me because I grew up in the pre-Vatican II church. You know, that's when the priest wore a dress with his back to the congregation and spoke in a dead language. And so I've been part of the evolution of the Catholic Church in both its good and bad experiences. But it's been just an extraordinary journey of learning to watch these young people explore the faith. And I'm learning, you know, almost as if I reopened the catechism all over again. So that's my story, and absolutely happy and privileged to be here with you. Just as a reiteration, since the International Community of Hope is grounded in Benedictine spirituality, the very first word in the rule of Benedict is listen. And the Benedictines listen with the ear of their heart. Listening is aligned with feelings. And you can't be a good listener if you don't have positive feelings toward the recipient of your listening. So that means that you have to accept the other person's feelings, whatever they are, how much you might disagree with them. It's still the reality that unless you are accepting of that person and the feelings that they're bringing to the table, that you're probably not going to be successful. So learning how to listen and accept another person's feelings at the same time is a critical piece of being a good active listener. In communication, often there's a difference between what you mean to say and what you actually say. And being a good listener helps with that practice. And a great reference for the distinction between what you mean to say and what you actually say is a book written by Deborah Tannen, Tannen. She's a professor at Georgetown University and an accomplished linguist. And one of her bestsellers is called That's Not What I Meant. And she wrote the book based on the relationship with her husband, who was not an American. So it's a very, very interesting book. And she was interviewed on The Tonight Show, and she appeared in all these lay journals because it's such a relevant piece of how we communicate with other people. And how many times have you said that? No, that's not what I meant. What I really meant to say was, well, why didn't you say it the first time? So the recurring theme throughout the entire module is compassionate listening. And in our breakout session, someone brought up the whole issue of funerals. And that was an example I was going to be using in terms of compassionate listening. Sometimes we don't have to really say anything. We just really need to listen. But the other critical thing, and we have to be very mindful of that in Houston, because we're one of the most diverse cities in the United States, there are culture points connected to listening. So you not only need to know who you're speaking with, you need to understand their frame of reference and where they're coming from. And we'll get into that a little bit later. So as an academic, I feel compelled to let you know that in my specialty, which is communications, applied linguistics, teaching English to non-native speakers of English, in particular teaching adults, that we had to constantly explore the phases of communication which begin with listening. And that's what a lot of people forget, that listening is a communication skill. It's the first skill we learn. You don't learn to speak without listening first, which is why hearing impaired children have difficulty with speaking. Hearing impaired individuals, adults often have difficulty with speaking because listening is the foundational component of the whole communication process. First, we learn to listen, then we learn to speak. If we're lucky, we learn to read, and if we're even luckier, we learn to write. But all of those elements are connected, and they're grounded in speaking, in listening. And a companion piece of being a good listener is being an active listener, because 65% of all communication is communicated non-verbally.
How many percentage?
65%. So much of the message that we send to someone while we're listening includes how they perceive us through our body language, and vice versa. So why is listening such a difficult skill? Well, for one thing, we don't practice it. We're a very verbal culture, increasingly more with all the devices and media that we have to our at our disposal, that we fill the void. There's the fear of the void.
Mhm.
What will happen if I don't say anything?
Mm.
Well, probably nothing, which is a good thing. And the reason we don't practice listening a lot, I think, is because it's one of the receptive skills. Listening and reading are both receptive skills, and both of them have to be practiced so that we can get better at it. Well, how do you get better at a skill you can't even see? Well, you have to do it a lot. And you have to learn that the most important component of any communication encounter is not what you said, it's what you heard and how you listened.
Hearing.
Okay. So in the module, I love the example that they give you, the opening paragraph, and feel free to walk through the module with me, because that's what I'm going to be doing. The foundation of all pastoral care is love and compassion. That's the opening statement in your listening module. And how do you express love and compassion? Often, the best way to express it is by saying absolutely nothing. And how many times have you visited a patient in a hospital, for example, and just laying your hand on that person's hand without saying anything made the difference in how that person felt in that moment? That's nonverbal communication. So at the end of this Old Testament story of Job and his great suffering, the last sentence says, they sat with him on the ground 7 days and 7 nights, and no one spoke a word to him, for they saw that his suffering was very great. Have you ever had the privilege of sitting Shiva at with a Jewish family after the death in the family? It's just an extraordinary experience, because for, I can't remember, is it 7 or 9 days?
I don't remember.
It's 7 days, and you sit with the family in their home, and there's always a lot of food, of course. It's a Jewish house. But most of the time, you're just sitting with the family and sharing space. And if they want to talk, they talk. If they don't, they just sit. And your role is to just be present, which is a critical component of listening skills. And that is that you are simply present in the circle of the person you're trying to assist and trying to help. So if you skip down to, they spend a lot of time talking about Job's friends and the characteristic, the primary characteristic of compassionate ministry, which is a critical piece, the ministry of presence. True listening, being present with empathy. Compassionate listening presupposes a willingness to hear the deepest thoughts and feelings of others. Critical statement. But the first sentence in the final paragraph of that section, compassionate listening is a reflection of the depths of our spiritual lives. Our spiritual lives are grounded in our capacity to listen to God. And I grew up in the Catholic Church, and the only way I knew how to pray was those memorized prayers that the nuns taught us. So when I started looking ecumenically at a prayer life and learning how to take a spiritual journey by stepping outside the Catholic Church, one of the great things I learned was how to pray. And praying is a conversation with God, but it doesn't have to be spoken out loud. In fact, some of the most meaningful retreats I've taken are retreats where a huge component of the time we spend together is in silence, because we're having a conversation with God in our heads and in our hearts. Remember, you listen with the ear of your heart. And the first person that you're learning to listen to is God, because God is always speaking to you in your head. And I mean, if you're lucky, you hear God's voice. I don't know what that sounds like, other, at the movies, right? But if you have a strong spiritual life, God's voice is always in your head. And that's the model that we have to follow as caregivers and as compassionate lay chaplains, is that the message that's being conveyed by the care recipient is a message that's okay to land in our heads without us even responding. So at the bottom of that first page, let's take a look at the objectives for this module. I won't insult you by reading them to you, but they're all extremely important. Any comments or questions about those bullet items, or anything that isn't clear to you based on your reading prior to this day?
No, but when you said God's voice is always in your head, always in your head. So then if you're close enough to him, can you kind of think your thoughts are from him?
Why not?
Mhm.
I have very close friends who actually say they have conversations with God.
Right.
And this one person, has a spiritual website, and he's actually a Christian executive coach. And he has conversations with God he starts his day, conversations with God, and he actually calls God Dad.
Oh.
Okay, so Dad, this morning you told me to do XYZ, and I said, Gary, first of all, explain what God's voice sounds like. And explain how you have these conversations. And he said, well, Michelle, they're in your head. God's talking to you all the time, every day, every way. And he starts his day off by having this conversation with God that started in the middle of the night when he was asleep. So lots of learning for this rule-governed Catholic who had to learn how to pray from somebody else. Page 2, what I'm planning to do with you through the extent of my time, and hold up your hand when I run over, is simply to highlight the elements in the module that I think you should pay very close attention to. And I'm hoping that's okay with you. So on page 2, at the bottom of the first paragraph in the synopsis, the very last sentence, we are to listen to others at many levels. But the part of that sentence that I think is most important is after the semicolon. It is important to distinguish between the facts the speaker expresses and the significance of those facts in the speaker's life. That's a critical piece. Distinguish between the facts the speaker expresses and the significance of those facts in the speaker's life. How many times have you heard that it's almost a contradiction in terms? I love my son, but he never calls me. So what's the underlying message there? What are you actually hearing from that person?
I'm angry with my son.
Yeah, I'm really angry with my son, but I don't know how to express it. And I'm also kind of embarrassed to admit that I'm angry with my son.
Right.
So what's the real issue here? That sort of thing. In the next paragraph, the final sentence, because effective pastoral caregiving flows out of our relationship with God, we must spend time in silence and solitude with him. And again, this is a culture point, especially for Americans. The fear of the void. How do you have a conversation with God if it's going to be in silence and solitude?
Mhm.
Well, we have to practice. It's a critical piece. We have to learn how to trust in the silence that we embrace. And we have to learn how to feel comfortable being silent. Most of us aren't. And in fact, most of us don't feel comfortable being alone, especially since the majority of any human population is an extrovert. Those of us who are introverts are at the bottom of the scale in terms of human interaction, not because we're shy, but because we prefer quiet and silence
Mhm.
as a way to contemplate and study, observe, and communicate. Nobody believes that I'm an introvert. I'm a socialized extrovert because I started my life as a teacher and ended my career as a fundraiser. How can you be a fundraiser if you're an introvert?
Right.
Well, you practice. And fortunately, I'm a good communicator. So I learn how to communicate with people and ask good questions and learn about them and learn why they would love to give money to us. Right. So
Need to teach a class on that, Michelle.
but when I took part in the initial training program for the international, for the American Leadership Forum, which is a leadership development program that was founded by Joe Jaworski in Houston, we spent 5 days at a dude ranch in Colorado. And part of one of the days was a 5-hour session where we were out in one of the fields sitting by ourselves. We could take a notebook and a pencil if we wanted to. We could take reading material, but we couldn't speak to anybody. And while they were talking about the agenda of this piece, I could see the high-end extroverts on the other side of the room hyperventilated
Yes.
because what am I going to do for 5 hours? Yeah, and we said, well, you could talk to yourself. There's that.
Okay.
And everybody said that it was an extraordinary learning journey. For those of us who are introverts, we couldn't wait to get out of these group sessions. And I mean, I'm an adult educator, and I know that great learning takes place through group process. But I hate it. I hate being in a group because I don't want to be forced to speak. So I couldn't wait until the next to the last day of this training session when I was going to be out in a field of wildflowers, sitting by myself and not having to talk to anybody. Okay, so that's a learning journey. And one of the first steps that often you need to take as you're building a relationship with a client, like a care recipient, with anyone you're going to be interacting with on a pretty regular basis, is to find out what their preferred form of communication is. How should I talk to you? How should we talk together? Do we need to be talking all the time? Just ask questions about their preferences. I mean, we do it if you're inviting them for dinner at your house. Have any allergies? Is there anything I shouldn't be serving to you? Are you a left-hander? Should I sit you at a certain place at the table? So why wouldn't we ask those same kinds of preferential questions in terms of communication, which is the essential element of building relationships, especially in the caregiving situation? Okay.
Find out what do you say to this person about how do we talk?
Tell me
Preferred
how
form
you
of
tell me how you would like us to communicate with each other. That's it. They may have never even thought about it. especially if it's a child or an adolescent. Are you kidding me? Somebody's asking me how I would like to be communicated with,
Well, yeah.
or someone who works in a very restricted environment. You know, again, rule governed behavior. They may not know that they're allowed to speak or not speak, right? Under the teaching content section, second paragraph, first sentence, to love is to listen. Isn't that a great expression?
Yeah.
And at the top of the next page, 3, end of the paragraph, when we're in the company of others, Bonhoeffer talks about listening and service. They forget that listening can be a greater service than speaking. That's a powerful statement. Listening can be a greater service than speaking. The ability to listen well is the most important element in a caring relationship. How many times have you heard that from someone? Oh, my husband just never pays attention to me. What they mean is he's not listening, or she's not listening. Well, we don't communicate well, which means neither one is listening to the other. Right? Okay, here's a critical piece, second paragraph, 1, 2, 3, third paragraph. Listening must be a conscious activity, and conscious activity is written in italics. And this returns to the deacon who's the hospice, the chaplain at the hospice. First, good listeners are able to set aside their own physical and psychological distractions so they can concentrate on what the others are saying. That's being present. That means I'm setting everything that relates to me aside so I can be fully present and invested in you by being a good listener. Good listeners observe carefully. They accept and honor others just as they are. They're non-judgmental. Good listeners are willing to enter into an experience where they themselves must be changed by having to confront and accept their own limitations. That's a powerful challenge, isn't it? Very powerful statement. We can help transform other people's suffering into the joy of knowing God more intimately. Again, a powerful statement. Imagine being able to change somebody's life just by being a good listener. And often we think it's the other way around. And if I say the right thing, I do the right thing, you know, she said she liked calla lilies. If I bring those instead of the carnations, maybe it'll be better. No, what she wants is for you to listen to her. Or he wants you to listen to him. Or they want you to listen to them. Whole lot of conflict in our society, in every sector now, because people simply aren't listening to each other in an active way. We can transform suffering into the joy of knowing God more intimately. Wow, that's pretty powerful, just by being a good listener. But again, it means we have to practice. And it's not easy to practice receptive skills. So then in the final paragraph of that page, it says, in any relationship, there are different levels of listening. And here we go again. The first level is silence. Golly.
Yeah.
How do I communicate by not saying anything? We demonstrate through our body language, eye contact, and physical touch that we're truly interested in the other. That's that nonverbal communication. Remember, 65% of all messages are sent nonverbally. When I worked for the Houston Police Department, I taught a course called Active Listening Skills. And the worst offenders were the detectives.
I didn't think they needed to.
Right, well, that's the first thing. None of them thought they needed any training in communication at all. The patrol officers were a little easier to deal with because they interacted with people all the time. And some of them had good communication skills and some of them didn't. But the detectives were the worst offenders because in many cases they were dealing with victims and witnesses who were vulnerable and intimidated to begin with. And so after one of my presentations this one afternoon, one of the detectives literally stood up and said, these are in the days when they all wore coats and ties, stood up and he said, are you telling me that just because I lean across the desk and fold my arms that I'm intimidating someone?
Yeah.
I said, well, if I were a different person, I'd be intimidated right now. You stood up and crossed your arms and asked me that question. Yes, every movement that you make. First of all, you're in a situation where that's unequal. You are a power broker in an environment that's scary to the other person, whether they're a victim or a witness or a felon. They're in a place they don't want to be. And instead of helping them, you're making things worse. And sometimes we all unconsciously commit that error. We're so intent on wanting to help. But what we don't realize is our helping strategies don't have to be physical. They can be quiet, and so we can just be present. That's the best way that we can be helpful. So, among the different levels of listening, the very first level is silence. And we demonstrate through all of these. We also observe the other person's nonverbal communication by looking at their nonverbal cues. And in some cultures, I'm sure you probably know this, in Asian, we place a high level of regard for direct eye contact. But in some cultures, especially Asian cultures, direct eye contact is an insulting form of engagement, especially children to elders. So you have to work around those pieces, which is one of the reasons why you have to know the background the person is coming from that you're engaging with. It's really critical to know a little bit about the person's cultural background and experience and the culture points that you might trip over while you're trying to be a good listener. Okay. The next phase is that we acknowledge others' words through non-committal responses. And they use examples like, I see, really. Sometimes I personally find it irritating when somebody does those vocalizations, because it sounds like all they're doing is verbal nodding rather than actually listening. But again, you need to know the recipient well enough to know that, especially if you're on the telephone, and there's dead silence at the other end, it might be helpful if they know that you're listening simply by saying, oh, I see, I understand. But often clarification points help. Tell me more about that. I'd like to hear more. I'm really interested in knowing what you have to say about that. And that brings them out. Because again, it's entirely possible that this person simply has never been listened to adequately. So the fact that you're saying, oh, I see where you're coming from. Don't say I understand, because you can't understand what a person is going through because you're not that person. But you can say, I see where you're coming from. Tell me more about that. I'd really like to learn more about what you're telling me. And the next level of communication is to go, I love this phrase, go below the words expressed and listen for the underlying meaning. The difference between facts and meaning. Okay. So it's been a month since my son called me. That's a fact. But what's the meaning of that statement? Why is that critical to that person that you're visiting in the nursing home?
Are you gonna know that automatically?
Hmm?
Will we know that are we smart enough to know that they're angry?
You'll hear it.
You'll know.
You'll hear it?
You'll know it. Yeah. They'll tell you. Because first of all, you're not going to get any information from this person if you haven't built a bond of trust. Trust is a critical factor, and you can't have empathy without trust. Empathy is a critical emotion that has to take place in order for you to be a good communicator. But you don't get empathy without trust. And you build trust by being present.
It seems to me, when you're in a conversation, every time somebody volunteers a statement like that, there's a motive.
Mhm.
They wouldn't say it if they weren't trying to convey something, even if they weren't consciously intending to convey it.
Exactly. There's a reason I'm saying this.
Yeah, why did they say that?
Mhm.
In the first session that we had, or the second session, my priest spoke and he was talking about pastoral theology. And he said, people come to me all the time. And he said, they tell me what the problem is. And if I'm very lucky, I hear what the problem really is.
Mhm.
There you go.
So it's what you say and what you mean.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's that underlying message that they point out in your module, which is absolutely a critical piece. So, and they describe it here. Facts describe what has happened to me. Meaning reveals how what has happened to me makes me feel.
Yeah.
That's the critical piece. In the next paragraph, it opens with the phrase compassionate listening. It's action that flows out of our relationship with God. Listen to God, listen to scripture. And one of the words of advice in this paragraph is, we must take time to eliminate outer and inner distractions to be with God in silence and solitude. Outer and inner distractions. That means while you're praying, you don't have NPR on to catch up on the news, right?
Right, even if you have it on
Or
mute.
even if you do, right? I love this this section at the bottom of page 4, where they introduce Morton Kelsey and his pamphlet called Listening. I know it's from 1976, but it's still so relevant. Many people are looking for an ear that will listen. Isn't that interesting? Many people are not looking for somebody to talk to them. They're looking for somebody to listen, to simply pay attention. And by the way, as a communication specialist, one of the things that we focus on in applied linguistics is attending skills, not attending as in showing up, but attending as being attentive, learning how to listen. And we teach that in particular to our international students who are learning English as a second language. Attending skills are those elements of learning that dysfunctional students exhibit more than any other learning disability. They don't know how to pay attention. And so paying attention as an active listener who is a lay chaplain is a very critical piece. And you pay attention with every physiological component of your body and your psychosocial dimension. So you listen, you watch, you look at the body language, and you ask God to guide you through this listening process. So at the bottom of this quoted passage from Martin Kelsey, he says, anyone who thinks that his time is too valuable to spend keeping quiet, I love this. I'll say it again. Anyone who thinks that his time is too valuable to spend keeping quiet will eventually have no time for God or his brother, but only for himself and his own follies. And how much of that do we see in the news?
So,
People who don't have time to be quiet, all they're doing is yammering away and not listening. Politicians in particular, this current generation of politicians, irrespective of their age, I'm talking about generation, like a class of politicians, they've forgotten that they're there because they're representing us and they're not listening to us.
Wow. Michelle, may I
Yes.
ask a question?
Of course.
I find myself surrounded sometimes by people who do want to have all the conversation. They don't, in my opinion, don't want to hear from anybody else. They only want to hear themselves. And being the listener that I try to be, I try to listen. But, you know, I don't feel, and it's not a caregiving type relationship. It is just a regular type of relationship. And at some point you just kind of tune it out, because I have felt that it's not going to be a two-way communication. It is all one way. Any guidance on that?
I think one of the things that you have to consider, anyone who is wanting to take over a conversation or a discussion, or wants the whole focus to be on him or her or them, whatever pronouns you're using these days, is that they need some level of attention. And I think that's where your questioning strategies can come in. If they're trying to take over a conversation, you can redirect their activities by asking them questions. Tell me more about that. Or you can take a completely compassionate view. And, you know, we Catholics have this saying that I'll offer it up to God, especially during Lent. Well, you know, that's not a bad concept. You know, you say, I'm not sure that I can relate to this person at this time. So what I'm going to do is simply let his or her communication wash over me while I attempt to listen and filter out essential messages that that person is trying to convey. Is there an underlying meaning to what that person is trying to convey, other than just trying to take total control over the environment that you find yourselves in? It's complicated. It's not an easy task, in particular, if you have a close relationship with that person or with that group of people. You can also say, and I've done this myself, you know, especially if you're in an environment that lends itself to that kind of breaking point, you can say, excuse me for just a second, I need to take a break. And they'll think you're going to the restroom, but what you're doing is simply leaving the room so you can clear your head. And then when you come back and go out and say a prayer and say, help me walk through this process, and then go back into the room and say, I'm just going to pretend that I'm a therapist and I'm listening. And because that's what good therapists do, they listen.
Thank you.
Sure. I don't think I even answered your question, but it's complicated, especially in a strong relationship building activity. first of all, you don't want to hurt someone that you might be close to. Even though that person indirectly is hurting the whole group by consuming the time that is meant for group interaction. And even if it's a one-on-one interaction and that person just simply won't stop talking, there's a stopping point where you can say, I think what you're saying is really important, or I've learned a lot from what you've said today, but I'd like to go away for a few minutes and think about what you've told me and continue our conversation later. I've found that, yeah, I mean, shame on you if you don't mean it, then, and I'm a Catholic, I can go to confession. So, but I found that works. And you do it enough times, they start, if they're smart, they start getting the message. So.
Well, some people is not that smart. Believe me.
Sadly, I know. So, how are we doing?
Tricia, how's our time?
We're good.
Okay, so back to page 4, after that wonderful message. It is vital, the final paragraph, it's vital to discover the care receiver's pastoral needs and address them so that they feel affirmed, acknowledged, and encouraged. And the way that you do that is by listening. There we go. It's a circle. Listening allows others to feel heard, to explore, to clarify, and to add their own thought and add to their thoughts and feelings about what's in the depths of their hearts. And remember, the Benedictines say that you listen with the ear of your heart.
Yes.
Peace. So, top of page 5. Somebody have a question? Top of page 5. Listening is vital because we can love only those human beings to whom we listen, and love is the heart of the spiritual way. I think that's worth saying more than once. Listening is vital because we can love only those human beings to whom we listen, and love is the heart of the spiritual way. Well, how do you love somebody you don't know?
Right.
Well, isn't that the Jesus way?
Yeah.
Love is the foundational element of Christianity. And you love the stranger. That's why the Benedictines welcome strangers in their monasteries, because you are welcoming that person as if that person is Jesus Christ. So love is an emotion, and it's a skill that we have to embrace. It's not just Valentine's Day. Love is an emotion and a skill that we have to practice. And we have to love our enemies. We have to love people we don't know. When we walk into that room or into that office space or into that engagement where we're invited to become a listener, we have to immediately figure out, what am I going to do to learn how to love this person? Tough challenge, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yes.
The really irritated person who's not a good patient and is really frustrated by being in that hospital bed or in the nursing home, or complicated because that automobile accident meant that I couldn't take my cruise, and now I've got this stupid crutch and I'm really irritated. Well, how do you love somebody who's angry all the time? You have to practice.
That is really hard.
It's very hard.
Really?
Of course it's hard. It's very difficult. I'm not saying it's hard. But anything that's worth embracing and having as a component of a fulfilled life has to be practiced. Now, if you're a marathon runner, you don't get to be a good marathon runner by watching films of other people running. right? You don't learn a new language. Just, sorry to say this, babble. But you don't learn a new language by listening in a learning lab and watching it on your iPad. You learn a new language by interacting with people who speak that language. And then you learn the culture because language is embedded in culture. You can't do one without the other. And it's the same thing with caregiving. Love is embedded in the practice of human engagement. And you only can love someone if you know how to listen to that person. So listening is being silent. I love this phrase. Listening is being silent with another person in an active way.
I love that too.
Isn't that great? The true listener is one who's quiet, yet sensitive, open and active, receptive and alive. Learn those 4 words. To be a true listener who's quiet and sensitive, you have to be open and active, receptive and alive. Not an easy task, something you have to practice. So then the next part of page 5 says, relating Benedictine spirituality to listening. And I love this. Let's see, 1, 2, 3. The 3rd paragraph, Saint Benedict wrote his rule with a community of laypersons in mind, because the role of Benedict actually wanted to be by himself, quiet, living in a cave. And all these people started seeking him out. You know,
That's funny.
help us do this. Help us, help us, help us. And so he established the monastery as a school for the Lord's service. Now, there are some monasteries that are silent. There are, if you ever have an opportunity to watch the movie called Into Great Silence, it's about a Capuchin monastery in France that have a commitment to silence, like the Trappists. The whole movie, with the exception of the narrator who talks about the different phases of becoming a monk in that environment, whole movie is quiet. It's just extraordinary. But the Benedictines are workers, you know, ora et labora, work and prayer. And when I'm at the monastery, my favorite part of the day during the week is the noon mass, the noon prayer service, when the monks all come back from their work posts. So some of them are teachers at the boys' school that's at the monastery, so they're still in their garb. But most of them are coming in either from the wood shop or from the fields or from the brewery or from the sweet shop where they make peanut brittle, or now they have a new candle shop, or wherever they were working. And they're in these weird outfits, you know, overalls or shorts in the summer, and very sensible shoes, not the sandals that they usually wear, trainers. And there they are in the chapel behind the altar in their ordinary garb, chanting the noon prayer. It's just an extraordinary experience because you see this combination of these men who live a life of spirituality, but pay attention to work as a way of serving God to enhance their spirituality. Pretty remarkable. I love that part. So the monastery is a school for the Lord's service. And wherever Benedictines are, they're always invited, usually by the bishop of the diocese where they find themselves, to be engaged in the community. Some of them are pastors of churches, many of them are teachers. But their goal is to, as a community of monks, to engage the community at large, to live by the rule of Saint Benedict, which is to listen with the ear of your heart. So Benedict provides a place and a structure that If you don't know Esther DeWall, she's an author you should get to know. She's marvelous. She just wrote a book recently called The White Stone. It's a relatively new publication about her own life transition from being the wife of the the Bishop of Canterbury,
Oh, Archbishop.
Archbishop of Canterbury. Her husband worked at that cathedral, and she was his partner. And then something happened to their marriage, and she describes that process by going back to this cottage in the countryside that had a stream running through it, and she collected a white stone that gave her both a physiological sense of connection to this place that was so meaningful for them. And she wrote this book called The White Stone. It's a wonderful read. But all of her books, Esther DeWall writes a great introduction to Benedictine spirituality, and that's worth a read. She encourages the dialogue of master and disciple, in which the ability to listen is fundamental. For Benedict, listening involves much more than hearing. Hearing is a physiological process. You can hear the thunder, but listening to the rain is different. It is listening with the whole person, body, mind, experience, and love. It requires an awareness which turns listening from a cerebral activity into a living response. It's another great sentence that you should embrace. An awareness which turns listening from a cerebral activity into a living response. Powerful stuff. The end of that paragraph, God speaks to us through our fellow human beings. I love that phrase. God speaks to us through our fellow human beings, whether we like them or not. Right. So to listen to them is to love them. Here we go, back to that love thing again. We respond to God by reaching out to the hurting, the unpleasant, the irritating, the unattractive, and to become collaborators with Him in our healing journeys. I love the word collaboration because most people don't know how to do it. And there's a difference between cooperation and collaboration. Collaboration means that everyone is equal at the table. There might be a facilitator who helps the process along, but collaboration means when you are participating in an activity or some sort of function, you all have an equal voice. When I was working in philanthropy, I tried to get some of the philanthropic organizations and the not-for-profit organizations to collaborate on common projects. And that was a tough call. For one thing, the not-for-profit organizations were afraid that if they collaborated, they'd lose their funding because this group would get and we wouldn't. No, if you are collaborating, you're all going to get money. You might get a little less than you thought you would, but you're all going to get it, and all together think about the outcomes of the project. But to get philanthropic organizations to collaborate, yikes. Combined checks written together? No. That's too big an ask.
Right.
Benedictine spirituality is about listening to four realities. And I have this starred in my book. Benedictine spirituality is about listening to four realities: the Gospels, the rule, one another, and the world around us. And I see this in living examples every time I go to the monastery. The Gospels, they live by the rule, they live with one another, and the world around them. It's an absolutely fascinating and compelling and life-affirming experience. So on page 6, here we are back to Joan Chittister, who I love. By the way, I was introduced to Joan Chittister by my good friend, a Lutheran minister. And she gave me the book that I brought with me today. She gave me for my birthday in 2013. She wrote a passage in the book that said, I use this as part of my daily devotional each morning when I start my day. And she said, I would hope that you would begin doing that practice as well. I think you'll enjoy this book. You had the heart of a Benedictine before it became official.
Well, that was nice.
Wasn't that nice?
Yeah.
So Joan Chittister has commented, it takes a lot of listening to hear the needs of those around us before they even speak them. That's where your observational skills come in, and that whole body language piece. But there is no good human community without it. Listening and love, here we go again. Listening and love are clearly of a piece. And then she asks this very challenging question, which I would like to hear some responses to. Do we impose past experiences on our present lives? And I'll start by answering, of course. How many of us inform the present by being mired in the past? That's why there's a shift in focus on strategic planning in organizations that do strategic planning. So many of them start with what happened before. Well, that's in the past. And if you base your strategic plan or your forward plan or any kind of a plan on the present, by tomorrow, the present's going to be the past. So you have to start talking immediately about the future. And how do you do that? By reaffirming your values. What's your value set? What value system do you live by? Personal, familial, institutional? What are your values and how do you live by those values? And how do you plan? Do you spend too much time walking backward through your head and looking at, if only I had done this, if only I had done that, blah, blah, blah. Well, you didn't. You made the decision that you thought was right at the time. You didn't do it. Now you're in the present, but you need to be planning for the future. How do you do that? You do that by focusing on listening with the ear of your heart, first to God, however you hear that voice, and then by listening to the people whose lives are important to your life. And that's it for me.
When you said how many of us live our lives by what happened in the past, my immediate thought is, why do you think so many of us are in therapy? Because we're trying to get that out.
Right.
It's pretty stuck.
Mhm.
Well,
It's hard not to.
you gotta build your own frame of reference,
Exactly.
and your frame of reference is just plastered together from all the stuff that's gone on in your life before. If it's healthy, that's great. If it's not, then maybe you need some help.
Bingo.
Right. That's
Bingo.
why that exercise on the back of, the grid that you talked about this morning, the exercise that's on the back of that asks you what your familial experiences
Yeah.
were, what feelings were expressed, feelings and early experiences. Oh my.
Yeah, that's a
Very reserved. Talk about an introvert. I mean, I don't think my father was even on, there was no scale of introvertism that would
Lower.
reflect him. Right.
good job.
Yes.
Are you a Myers-Briggs devotee?
Oh, big time. Yes.
I love.
There's no scale for my father.
Socially trained introvert. Yeah, that works.
My father was a military officer, German, raised by,
German military
German
man,
is
oh
even
Lord.
thank God for his Irish mother who
Oh,
gave him
good.
a sense of humor. But, this is a phrase from my father. Whenever we were leaving someplace, he'd say, here's the upside. we're going to go to a new place and we're going to discover a new adventure and you're going to meet new people. Great. But on the train, don't cry as you're saying goodbye to people because you'll make them feel bad. Wait till you get on the train to cry. So, and the older you get, the longer you can hold in the tears. And so how many years can you hold in those tears until you get to release them?
Right.
On the other side, my mother, and some of you are old enough to know this name, the Pearl Mesta of our house, the entertainment guru, go out there and say hello to our guests before you go and do your homework. What am I going to say to these adults? Because I'm more like my father than my mother.
Right.
God bless her. When I became an officer's wife and entertained, I knew how to entertain because of my mother. But so that exercise was really meaningful for me because my whole upbringing, and then my grandmother, who was this extremely poised, etiquette-oriented person who never appeared out of the house without being, she'd walk up the half a block to the grocery store on the corner, but she'd get completely dressed with makeup and everything, because she was also a hairdresser and a cosmetologist and owned a beauty shop. So you had to look good in public, even to buy a pound of square cheese. So, but she's the one who taught me about good manners and, being gracious and engaging, and had great sensibilities to other cultures because she was born in the United States, but of immigrant parents, and was very accepting of people from all walks of life, especially people who had less. And I learned a lot by watching her interact with other people.
By any chance, did you grow up in New York?
Philadelphia.
Philadelphia?
Close.
Yeah. Can you hear it?
Yep.
I can-
Coffee.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
coffee.
So let me stop. I've talked too much already. So I would like to hear some comments about that last sentence. Do we impose past experiences on our present lives? Do we?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
And Andy, I love your comment that sometimes it's difficult to dispense with our past lives in order to move to the next step.
I'm not minimizing.
Yeah,
By any
no,
means.
it's critical.
Yeah,
I mean, and it's one of the reasons why really good therapists delve into your background, because you have to know what your starting point was before you can figure out how you got here, and then to determine where you want to go. And a lot about where you want to go is dependent on where you've been.
there was a wonderful, if you're with a show called Call the Midwife,
Oh, God,
Oh,
I
yeah.
love that.
and
I have it taped.
one of the introductory little paragraphs that the narrator says talks about how the past shapes our lives. And it starts, and I have it printed out and it's plastered over my desk. And it starts out, the past is with us always.
That's right.
And in this context, for better or for worse.
exactly.
But it can't define us. And it shouldn't,
Well,
And
too
it-
many people let
it can
define.
only inform us, but it shouldn't define us.
That's the healthy view.
Yes, exactly.
Not everybody's.
Mhm. Yeah, we used to say, I got my doctorate at Texas A&M, which is a very tradition-bound organization. And at the time I was there, we used to say that the graduate college at Texas A&M was committed to transition without change.
That's good.
Wonderful.
I agree with that.
I have to remember that. There's a lot of places. like
Tradition
that.
without change.
That's a class.
Michelle, an example that I have is I had moved to another community, another town in Texas and started a new church. And they were calling, they had called a new pastor at the same time that I started attending within like 2 weeks. And one of the first things that he did was walk through the history. He had community meetings in the evening, inviting everybody to come. And he had community meetings about the history. And being very new to the church, I did not know of a significant break that was probably less than 5 years old. And so I was wondering, well, why are we doing this? But because there had been so many other people there who had stayed and maybe not particularly healed from that hurt of that break. And they had lost a lot of people because of that situation and maybe hadn't, fully grieved the loss. And so it was a very informative, like you say, process for me as a newcomer, and I think healing process for those who had been there before. And then from that point, we were able to say, here's how we, having a new preacher, here's what our expectations are, and what is our future going to be. And so I really appreciated being involved in that process.
Well, and that also sent a powerful message from that new pastor that he was going to respect the past by looking at it from a historical perspective and then bringing his own, I'll use the word spin, his own spin on the new iteration of your combined experiences. But without acknowledging the past, I doubt if he would have been so successful. Because I think that's very important. We have to respect the past, good, bad, or indifferent, but we can't be grounded in the past. It's a paralyzing element.
True.
Anyone else?
Not chained to it.
That's exactly. We've always done it this way. How many times have you heard that
Change the
phrase?
light bulb.
Far too many, far too many.
Right. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Michelle. Does anybody have any closing questions for Michelle? She is going to be with us for the whole rest of the time. So if something pops up, we'll have some time at the end if you want to come back and ask her something.
Absolutely.
What we want to do now is it give you that time to practice that Michelle was talking about. Being a good listener requires practice.